Martin stood by the window of his old but cozy kitchen, holding a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. The early morning, as ordinary as dozens before it, stretched out beyond the window in a gray haze. He liked this time of day when the city was just waking up. The streets were deserted, only the rustling of leaves under a light breeze could be heard. But inside him, there was a silence that was not peaceful. It was the silence of emptiness. He looked at his reflection in the window glass for a long time. Black hair, heavily streaked with gray, wrinkles under his eyes reminded him of time that could not be stopped. But in his eyes there was still life. Deep inside him, something unyielding, rebellious, was stirring. Old age is for those who give up, he thought, clenching his fists as if he could stand up to nature itself. Since he retired, the days had blended into a monotonous canvas. The house where he once lived with his wife now seemed too big and too quiet. After her death, time seemed to stop, but loneliness only grew, filling every corner of his life. Morning news, a couple of calls with his sister per month, and walks in the local park. All of this had long turned into empty routine. Sometimes, to keep from going crazy, he would order things from the internet just to hear the knock at the door and see someone. On the day when the courier from the delivery service first appeared on his doorstep, Martin didn't feel anything special. An ordinary girl, athletic build, fair skin with a slight blush on her cheeks, and those stubborn red curls escaping from under the baseball cap with the delivery service logo. Lauren. In that name, there was a softness that didn't match her age. She was young, too young to be at the center of his attention, but something in her light smile and quick manner of speaking caught him. Martin noticed her strange energy right away, as if she was always in a hurry, but at the same time managed to see everyone. Her eyes lingered on people a little longer than usual. For the first time in a long time, he felt that someone was looking at him not as a random passerby or an old man who needed a seat on the bus. She looked at him as a person. He started ordering more often, books he didn't plan to read, kitchen appliances that had long been gathering dust in the cabinet. All for the sake of hearing her cheerful, "Hello, Mr. Martin," again, and seeing how she handed him the package with her usual slight tilt of her head. This week, the rain fell almost nonstop. Martin watched as the water trickled down the window, forming uneven drops, and thought about how much his morning had changed. He no longer waited for the news or rare calls. Now he waited for the knock at the door. The knock came unexpectedly loud, breaking the silence as if someone had climbed inside his thoughts and reminded him of reality. Martin opened the door and saw Lauren. Her face was wet from the rain, her red hair was soaked, but in her eyes there was still that inexhaustible energy. "Sorry for the rain," she said with a slight smile, pulling the package out of her backpack. "Today is a terrible day for delivery, but this is your last box for the week, Mr. Martin." Her words sounded as if she was teasing him, but there was something warm, almost caring, in her voice. "Thank you, Lauren. You should take a break. You're all wet," he said, pointing to the drops of water running down her cheeks. "Oh, it's nothing. I'm used to it." She waved it off, but suddenly leaned forward as if she was about to fall. "Lauren!" Martin managed to catch her by the elbow, noticing how she swayed. "It's nothing serious. I'm just a little tired," she said softly, trying to keep her balance. But he was no longer listening. His heart beat faster. He knew this feeling, this sudden concern for another person, this desire to help, even if you don't know how. For the first time in a long time, he felt alive. "Come on," he said firmly. "You can't keep working in this state. I'll make you some tea." Lauren initially tried to refuse, but fatigue and Martin's kindness won out. A few minutes later, she was sitting in his living room, wrapped in a warm blanket, with a cup of hot tea in her hands. She looked vulnerable, as if that endless energy that always surrounded her had suddenly disappeared. Martin looked at her and suddenly realized that for the first time in many years, he cared. She was not just a courier who brought him packages. She was someone who had awakened in him the desire to care, to live, to feel. "Thank you, Mr. Martin," she said, smiling a weak but sincere smile. "You are the kindest person I've met." And at that moment, Martin felt something change inside him. It wasn't just a rainy day. It was the moment when the world began to turn in a different direction. The silence in the room was almost tangible. Only the soft sound of rain outside filled the space, like music reflecting Martin's inner world. He sat across from Lauren, watching as she slowly sipped her tea, her fingers clutching the mug as if it were all that held her in that moment. In her eyes, usually so alive, he noticed a weariness that she desperately tried to hide. Tough day? He finally broke the silence, trying to sound carefree, but genuine concern still sounded in his voice. Lauren smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. Yes, it was one of those days when it seems like the world decided to test your strength. But I'm used to it. Someone has to deliver all these packages, right? Martin felt something tighten in his chest. This girl, barely older than his youngest niece, spoke in a tone that sounded too familiar to him. It was the voice of someone who was used to coping alone, who never showed weakness. You don't have to do everything alone, he said softly, almost in a whisper. It's exhausting. Sometimes you need to let someone help. Lauren looked at him, her gaze both surprised and slightly wary, as if she didn't know how to react to such openness. She was used to being strong. Being weak was a luxury she had long denied herself. And who will help? Her voice sounded bitter. Everyone just takes. There are few people in the world who are willing to give something just like that. These words, spoken in such a firm and bitter tone, struck Martin. They reflected what he himself had felt for so long, but was afraid to admit. He remembered the years when he, like her, tried to be strong, support others, while everything inside him crumbled. Sometimes, he said after a pause, looking straight into her eyes, people give because they want to be needed. Accepting help is not a weakness. It's life. Lauren lowered her gaze. A mixture of vulnerability and gratitude appeared on her face. She took a sip of tea, trying to buy time to gather her thoughts. You know, Mr. Martin, you're strange, she said with a slight smile that looked a bit more genuine this time. Usually people don't even look at me. I'm just a courier to them. But you seem to see more. Martin smiled, feeling how her words strangely warmed him. Maybe it's because I know what it's like to be unnoticed. This phrase hung in the air. Both were silent, but in that silence, there was something more than words. It was a connection, so delicate and vulnerable that it could be destroyed by one wrong move. But it was real. When the rain subsided, Lauren got ready to leave. She stood at the door, once again in her wet uniform, with her backpack on her shoulder. But now her gaze was a little softer, and her shoulders a little less tense. Thank you for the tea, Mr. Martin, and for the conversation. She smiled at him, and something new appeared in her eyes. You are a good person. The world needs people like you. Martin nodded but said nothing. Words stuck in his throat. When the door closed behind her, he felt a strange feeling spread inside him, a mixture of joy and anxiety. Joy from being able to brighten her day a little, anxiety from how much she had affected him. He returned to his chair by the window, but now his gaze was no longer directed outward. He looked inward. Why did he want to protect her so much? Why did her tired gaze and words about a world that only takes touched him to the core? He ran his hands over his face, feeling his own emotions beginning to surface. He understood. Lauren was not just someone who had accidentally entered his life. She had awakened in him something he thought was long lost. Hope, the desire to live. But this scared him. Too many years he had lived in his shell, where everything was safe and predictable. Lauren was like a sudden rain that blurred these boundaries, revealing something new, unexplored. And although he didn't know where all this would lead, he could no longer stop it. The rain turned into clear weather, but uncertainty reigned in Martin's heart. Lauren agreed to his offer to rent a room, but her agreement was as unexpected to him as the fact that he dared to offer it. He watched as the truck with her belongings pulled up to his house, and his heart pounded wildly, as if this was the moment that would change his life forever. He couldn't remember the last time he felt something like this. Maybe on his wedding day, maybe when his first son was born, or maybe when he first realized he was alone. Lauren emerged from the truck, looking more confident than he expected. She was in her usual jeans and a simple t-shirt, but there was a lightness in her movements that he hadn't noticed before. She waved to him, smiling. Mr. Martin, I think this is your good morning, she said cheerfully, opening the back door of the truck. You won't just stand and watch, will you? We need help here. Martin chuckled, pretending her confidence didn't bother him at all. But inside he felt strange. We? He thought. This simple word so foreign to him for the past few years sounded like music. Of course I'll help. Although I would prefer to watch the youth work, he replied with a smile descending from the porch. They both laughed, and for a moment there was a lightness between them that he hadn't been used to for so long. It was more than just a joke. It was sincerity. In the evening, when the things were brought into the house and Lauren's room was set up, Martin watched her from the kitchen. She looked tired but satisfied. Lauren settled on a chair and enjoyed a glass of cold water. Her red curls were slightly disheveled, but there was an inner fire in her eyes that reminded him of himself in his youth. It's cozy here, she said, looking around. Your house. It breathes something real, as if it has a soul. Martin, who rarely heard such words, felt his throat tighten. The house, which he had long considered empty and lifeless, came alive in her words. This house hasn't seen anyone for a long time. Now everything is different, he replied, trying not to show how much these words affected him. Lauren looked at him, slightly frowning, as if trying to understand something. You didn't just offer me a room out of kindness, did you? Something inside you says that we both need this. Martin was silent, but her words echoed in his heart. He knew she was right. Lauren was not just a guest. She was someone who reminded him that life could be full if you allowed yourself to open the door. Late at night, when silence filled the house again, Martin sat in his chair, trying to sort out his thoughts. Lauren's presence had already changed his space. Her things, her voice, her energy, all of this filled the house with something new. But more than anything, he was concerned about how she had changed him. He suddenly felt the door to his life, which he had so carefully kept closed, beginning to open. It was scary and exciting at the same time. He thought about how long he had lived in loneliness, how he had gotten used to the silence. But now he felt that silence was no longer his ally. In the adjacent room, Lauren was unpacking her things. She heard the floorboards creak under Martin's feet and smiled. She knew that her presence in this house had become as much of a test for him as it was for her. But this was a beginning, and they both understood that. The evening was quiet. The air in the house seemed thick, as if permeated with something invisible but tangible. Lauren stood by the stove preparing dinner. She volunteered to cook something simple, saying she wanted to thank Martin for his kindness. Her red hair was gathered in a messy bun, and her face was focused as she carefully stirred something in a pot. Martin sat at the dining table watching her movements. For the first time in a long time, he felt alive. Not because of the food, not because of the quiet crackling of the fire in the stove, but because of her. She was here, in his house, filling his space with the energy he had missed so much. Every step, every gesture of hers said that she was not just a random guest, but something more. Do you always handle the kitchen so confidently? He asked, trying to dispel the silence that was beginning to seem too significant. Lauren smiled over her shoulder. Well, honestly, I had to learn. When you live alone and don't have time or money for cafes, cooking becomes a necessary skill. But I like cooking for someone. It's a different feeling. Martin nodded, feeling a warm wave rise in his chest. Her words touched something inside him, reminding him of the years when he and his late wife cooked together. But this feeling was different. It was not burdened with memories. It was something fresh, alive. When dinner was ready, they sat down at the table. The food was simple but delicious, and Martin couldn't help but notice how everything seemed different in her presence. Conversations about life, about little things, snippets of jokes. All of this created an atmosphere that he hadn't experienced for a long time. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Lauren settled on the couch, crossing her legs, with a cup of tea in her hands. Martin sat in the chair opposite her, feeling a strange tension growing inside him. It was not an unpleasant feeling, but it didn't let him relax. He realized that her presence was changing him. Not just the house, but him. Do you often look like that, Mr. Martin? Lauren suddenly asked, her voice soft but with a hint of playful reproach. He started, realizing he had been looking at her for too long. I'm sorry, I was just thinking that you brought something into this house that I haven't felt for a long time. Lauren looked at him, her eyes filled with warmth and something else. something he couldn't immediately identify. "I think this feeling is mutual," she replied, her voice a little softer, as if she was afraid to say these words out loud. And then the room was filled with this tension. It was almost physical, hanging in the air as if waiting for someone to break it. Lauren set aside her cup and leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting on her knees. Her gaze was focused on Martin. "Why are you so kind to me?" she asked, her voice trembling, but not from fear, from something deeper. Martin felt his heart begin to beat faster. He looked at her, trying to find the words, but instead, he simply stood up from his chair and moved closer. His movements were slow, almost uncertain, but there was a strength in them that pushed him toward her. He sat down next to her on the couch, feeling her warmth fill the space around him. Lauren did not move away. Her eyes remained fixed on his face. "Because I see in you what I haven't been able to see in myself for a long time," he finally said. His voice was low but firm, the words sounding like a confession from which there was no escape. Lauren exhaled slightly, her lips parted, but she said nothing. She just raised her hand and gently touched his hand. This gesture, simple and natural, made Martin feel like the world around him had stopped. Her fingers, warm and soft, lay on his skin. His breathing became a little deeper, and he looked into her eyes, which were so close. At that moment, everything inside him screamed, "This is wrong! This is dangerous!" But instead of stepping back, he raised his hand and covered hers. "Lauren," he whispered softly. "Don't say anything," she interrupted him, her voice just as soft. "Just be here." She leaned in slightly, and the next moment their lips met. It was a gentle, cautious kiss, but it seemed to explode everything around them. In this touch, there was everything. Years of loneliness, fear, hope, desire. Martin felt her hand slide across his cheek, her touch so light he could barely feel it. But it ignited a fire in him that he thought had long since gone out. His own fingers found her waist, and he pulled her a little closer. Her breathing became uneven as the kiss deepened. It was more than just physical attraction. It was a meeting of two souls who had found each other in a sea of loneliness. When they finally pulled away, both were breathing heavily, as if they had just run a marathon. Lauren looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and happiness. "I don't know what this means," she said softly. Martin, still holding her by the waist, smiled slightly. "It means we can no longer ignore what we feel." She nodded but did not move away. She stayed close, her fingers still touching his hand. And at that moment, in the quiet room, lit only by the soft light of a lamp, they both understood. There was no turning back from this path. Morning came quietly, almost stealthily, as if the world understood that the night had changed everything. The sunlight softly broke through the curtains, casting golden reflections on the floor and walls. Martin woke up early, as always, but this time something inside him was different. He lay in bed feeling a strange but pleasant calm. His thoughts returned to the night. Lauren's touch, her lips, her breath. All of it was real, alive, tangible. He got up carefully so as not to disturb the silence of the house. His feet silently slid across the wooden floor as he headed to the kitchen to make coffee. The movements were automatic, but the thoughts were chaotic. What does this mean? What now? These questions swirled in his head as he poured the dark liquid into cups. "Morning," Lauren's voice sounded unexpectedly. She stood in the doorway, her hair still slightly tousled, but there was a faint smile on her face. In her eyes, there was still that warmth that hadn't disappeared with the night. Martin looked up, feeling his heart beat faster again. "Good morning," he replied, handing her a cup of coffee. "Did you sleep well?" Lauren nodded, but there was a certain awkwardness in her gesture. She looked down at the cup she was holding, as if trying to find answers to the questions that were also swirling in her head. "This is all a bit unexpected," she admitted after a short pause. "I didn't plan for something like this to happen, but I don't regret it." Her words were simple but sincere. Martin felt the tension he had been carrying since morning beginning to ease. "I don't regret it either," he said, trying to make his voice sound firm. "Maybe it's unexpected, but I can't deny what I feel. You awakened something in me that I thought was long dead." Lauren looked at him, her eyes filled with warmth. She took a step forward, overcoming the distance between them, and set the cup on the table. I feel the same way, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. But this is scary. Isn't this wrong, really? Martin understood that her fears were his fears. Their age difference, the circumstances, everything that surrounded them seemed impossible. But at the same time, it was so right. Maybe it doesn't fit into what people consider right, he began, looking straight into her eyes. But none of them know what it's like to live feeling that life is passing you by. You made me realize that I'm still capable of feeling, of caring. How can that be wrong? Lauren did not answer. Instead, she reached out, touching his face, her fingers gently tracing his cheek. This touch was just as gentle as the night before, but there was a new confidence in it. Martin covered her hand with his and they both froze in that moment, as if afraid that any movement would break the magic. I don't know what will happen next, Lauren finally said, her voice softer, but I want to try. Martin nodded. These words, simple but sincere, awakened in him something he had long forgotten. Hope. In the following days, their relationship began to take a shape that neither of them could fully grasp yet. They grew closer. Their conversations became deeper, more sincere. Lauren talked about her life, about how she lost her parents early and had to grow up too fast, about how she got used to hiding her fears behind a smile, but now she felt she could be real. Martin, in turn, shared his memories, the pain of losing his wife, the feeling of loneliness that had become his constant companion. Their confessions were like threads that wove into a single fabric of their new reality. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lauren turned to him. I'm still scared, she said. What will people say if they find out? What will we say to ourselves if this all ends? Martin looked at her, his gaze calm but firm. Maybe people will talk. Maybe this will end someday. But if we don't try, we'll never know what we could have found. Sometimes you have to take a risk to understand what life is worth. Her eyes sparkled in the light of the setting sun. She leaned in closer, and their lips met again. This kiss was not like the first. It was filled with confidence, determination, and a promise. A promise that, despite all fears and doubts, they would fight for what they had found in each other. And at that moment, they both understood that they had begun a new chapter of their lives, full of risk, fear, but also hope. The house was immersed in silence, but it was not the frightening silence of loneliness that Martin had gotten used to over the past years, but a warm, almost tender silence. The silence filled with presence. Lauren's things, which had once seemed foreign to him, now looked like a natural part of this house. A small makeup brush on the dresser, her sneakers by the entrance, the scent of her shampoo that faintly lingered in the air. All of this had become a reminder that he was no longer alone. But today was a special morning. This could be felt even in the way the sun broke through the windows, drawing soft golden lines on the floor. Lauren sat at the kitchen table, spreading a map on the light brown wooden surface. Her hair was still slightly damp from the shower, loose strands falling on her face, but she looked focused. Next to her was a cup of coffee that she kept forgetting to sip. Are you sure this is a good idea? Martin asked, leaning against the doorframe. There was a mixture of doubt and excitement in his voice. Lauren looked up, and a slight smile appeared on her face. She looked as if every new day for her was a chance, not just another page on the calendar. No, I'm not sure, she admitted, but doesn't that make it even better? We've both spent too much time asking ourselves this question. What if? It's time to act. Martin took a step forward and sat down across from her, his fingers touching the edge of the map. She had marked several points, circling cities on the West Coast with a marker. Los Angeles, San Diego, Santa Barbara. He knew that for her, this was more than just a trip. It was a symbol, a step beyond the boundaries of their old lives. Are we just going to up and leave? Without a plan? Without insurance in case everything goes wrong? His voice sounded calm, but emotions were raging inside him. Lauren covered his hand with hers, her fingers gently squeezing his. Sometimes you have to leave the plans. Everything we need is already here, she said, looking straight into his eyes. I don't want to put off life anymore. Do you? These words touched something deep inside him, his entire existence. His whole life before this meeting had been about planning, caution, attempts to avoid pain. But now he realized that safety does not bring happiness. It just protects from risk, but also deprives one of the chance for something real. The next morning, they stood by the trunk of his old pickup truck. A couple of suitcases, Lauren's backpack, and a thermos of coffee were their only companions on this journey. Martin took one last look at the house. The house that he once considered his prison now seemed freed from the ghosts of the past. Its walls no longer held him captive. "Are you ready?" Lauren asked, smiling at him over her shoulder. "More than ever," he replied, getting behind the wheel. They drove down the highway, the wind ruffling her hair and soft music playing in the background. Martin looked ahead but occasionally glanced at Lauren. She looked so alive, so full of hope that he couldn't help but smile. "Have you ever thought about how roads change people?" she suddenly asked, looking into the distance. "As if the farther you go, the more you leave behind," Martin pondered. These words were surprisingly accurate. The road did change them. It not only distanced them from the past, but also led them to something new, something they couldn't yet understand, but were ready to accept. "Maybe it's not the roads that change people," he replied. "Maybe people just decide to change while they're driving." Her smile grew wider. She turned to him, and their eyes met. In that gaze was everything: gratitude, trust, love. They stopped at the beach in Santa Barbara when the sun was already setting. The waves gently lapped at the sand, leaving a whisper of water behind. Lauren sat on a blanket, her legs buried in the warm sand. Martin approached her with 2 cups of coffee they had bought at a roadside cafe. "It's beautiful here," she said, looking at the ocean, as if the whole world has stopped. "It's not the world," he said, sitting down next to her. "It's us who have stopped. The world is always moving." She smiled and leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. This was so natural that he felt a warm feeling spread through him. They were silent, but in that silence there was more than words could express. "Thank you," she suddenly whispered. "For what?" he asked, although he knew the answer. "For taking a risk, for believing, for being here." Martin hugged her, looking at the setting sun. This moment was not an ending. It was a beginning of something bigger than their past, than their fears. It was a beginning of the life they had chosen together. And at that moment, they both knew they had made the right choice.